Hello, and welcome to Connected with Latham, where we discuss ideas, legal developments, and business trends shaping the global economy. This is the fourth episode of the Latham & Watkins Drug Pricing Podcast, and I'm Chris Schott, a partner in the healthcare and life sciences practice in our Washington, D.C. office. I focus my practice on manufacturer compliance related to the Medicaid Drug Rebate Program, Medicare, and the 340B Drug Pricing Program. Joining me is Danny Machado, an associate in our Washington, D.C. office. Welcome, Danny.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be here again.
In each episode, we focus on a specific drug pricing topic, and after discussing the substance, we ask the question, which Olympic sport is it like? And we have the list of Olympic sports here to see which most resembles the topic in terms of strategy, complexity, or frankly, level of conflict. Danny, what is our topic for today?
Today, Chris, we were hoping to give our listeners some highlights from the 2023 MDRP Summit, which just took place in Chicago, September 18 through 20.
Absolutely. And maybe just to explain a little bit what this conference is to those who may not have attended, this is really the year's biggest conference for drug pricing matters. And it's a great opportunity to hear trends and updates from key industry stakeholders and, frankly, to network. And so Latham & Watkins has a booth at this conference where we welcome folks to stop by, and we have interesting giveaways, and it's a great opportunity to network and meet up with people. So, Danny, what were some of this year's highlights at the conference?
Some of the highlights, Chris, that I took away, I think fall probably into two big buckets. It's probably no surprise to most of us that the Inflation Reduction Act took a lot of the time of our speakers, and there were interesting topics discussed. As we know, CMS released the list of selected drugs for the initial price applicability year 2026 not too long ago, so manufacturers are still dealing with that. And of course, trade groups and manufacturers have brought various lawsuits that have challenged the IRA. So interesting topics regarding the Inflation Reduction Act. And then the second topic was the Medicaid proposed rule, the MDRP proposed rule, which was released by CMS in May 2023 of this year. So as we know, this is just proposed. It has not been finalized, but if it were to be finalized, there would be some interesting changes to the Medicaid drug rebate program, such as best price stacking. So these were interesting topics. I think those were two of the bigger ones that I noticed, Chris.
Yeah, and on the IRA, what's interesting is that we're at the cusp now of going from having had the law, the proposed negotiation guidance, and the final negotiation guidance into actually seeing it being implemented. Like you said, the first list of 10 drugs that will be subject to negotiation was published recently. And so we're at the cusp of kind of going from analyzing this law almost in a vacuum and trying to project its impact to really beginning to see what that impact may look like. And then it's interesting, you also mentioned the Medicaid proposed rule, because there is a connecting thread between those two topics, which is basically the role and the way in which CMS is interacting with agency. So as we know, in the IRA, the agency CMS is receiving new powers that it so far hasn't had, and it's beginning to use those now and to implement those in practice. And then similarly, in the Medicaid proposed rule, we're seeing the agency interact with the program in a more aggressive and expansive way. You mentioned best price stacking, which was also the topic of our last podcast episode. And there are other elements of that proposed regulation, such as identifying high-cost Medicaid drugs and publishing those, which again looks very reminiscent of the IRA as well. So we're really kind of seeing maybe CMS kind of emerging into a new stage here where it's going to be much more assertive, much more aggressive in how it's implementing the program. Those two topics were really the highlights of the conference.
Right. And to your point that CMS may be, aggressively interpreting some of the powers in the statute, especially for this proposed rule. Some of the conversations in the conference were that CMS likely knows that a couple of its positions that it's taken may be a little bit problematic from a legal perspective. But the fact that Joe Biden is running on drug pricing and reducing drug prices, if he loses in court, say if manufacturers or trade groups were to bring litigation against some of these interpretations, the president can just go to Congress and say, hey, I tried, so change the law. So it's not a huge loss for CMS to try to take the most aggressive position if it can.
Right. And the type of insight and analysis that you really can get at this conference as you're talking to leaders in the field. And that's what makes the conversation there interesting. I would say another good session, which was toward the end of the conference, dealt with compliance programs at pharma companies the sources for some of these compliance obligations and the history. So while the conference is over, you can still sign up and look at the streamed content. And I would definitely say that's worthwhile to go and pick some of the highlight sessions. And one of those would be that very last session of the conference, we discussed compliance programs, the history of those, and had an excellent, diverse panel of in-house experts and also outside counsel. Also, usually at these conferences, there is representation from the government, especially from CMS and sometimes HRSA, the Health Resources and Services Administration. This time we didn't really see that, Danny. Who did we have as presenters from the government this year?
Yeah, it was interesting, Chris. But from the government, we got representatives from the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, and then also OIG. The FTC talk, who the presenter was Rahul Rao. He's deputy director at the Bureau of Competition at FTC. He talked a little bit about the FTC's increased focus on pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs. He discussed a little bit about how in June 2022, FTC launched a 6-piece study into the PBM industry, basically a review of PBM records, PBM practices, essentially with an eye toward the affordability of prescription drugs, which we keep seeing as a theme in the past couple of years. There is a very sharp focus on the government on the affordability of prescription drugs.
Yeah, and what's interesting here for our manufacturer stakeholders is the focus on PBMs is likely to reflect more broadly on the industry. And obviously, it is manufacturers contracting with PBMs. So, this is definitely one thing to monitor how these PBM investigations and how that focus is going to evolve, because it's likely to also draw in some other stakeholders. And then there were also OIG representatives, right, Danny?
Yeah, the OIG spoke a little bit about their work involving prescription drugs. And oh, Chris, one of the things that you and I were talking about just a few minutes ago was how OIG said that IRA and the Inflation Reduction Act is a big focus of the OIG, and they have developed a multi-phase strategy to examine the implementation and the impact of the IRA.
Yeah, and I mean, they also mentioned the OIG work plan and projects that they have in progress right now, which is basically on the OIG website. But it was very interesting that one of their first slides focused on the statement that the IRA is going to be one of OIG's key focuses and will be a key focus at OIG. And that's significant because if you know the IRA provisions, they are quite hefty civil monetary penalties associated with conduct during the negotiation and later related to making the maximum so-called fair price available. So that's definitely noteworthy that OIG began its remarks by focusing on the IRA. So I think those are really the highlights from the conference, which takes us to the question, which Olympic sport is it like? Danny, which sport did you select?
Today, Chris, I'm going to go with rowing, not just because it's a fun sport, but I'm thinking back in history. Rowing was first used as a means of transportation in ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, Rome. But of course, we're not here for a history lesson. We're here to talk about how this impacts manufacturers. And I think that rowing is an interesting sport to choose because it differs from other sports in that rowers sit with their backs toward the direction of movement. So when they cross the finish line, they're facing with their backs. I think it's important for manufacturers and other players in this industry to not do that, right? To have their eyes fully open. You mentioned the compliance panel at the conference, and I think it's very important for manufacturers to have their eyes fully open, look forward, make sure that there's no surprises.
Fascinating that you picked that. I also have something in this sort of aquatic naval type world, namely water polo. And water polo, of course, is two teams trying to score goals. And what's interesting to me about this sport is on the surface, you see them moving the ball forward, but really the real action is underwater. You don't really see them swimming and struggling like crazy to move around in the pool. And that kind of reminded me of what we're doing here in the industry, right? So we're trying to advance the ball in terms of drug development, innovation that benefits patients and patient access. And we're kind of struggling. We're struggling through this inert body of water to try to get to the goal, as the government is slapping on additional requirements and additional things to be mindful of. So they're interesting that we both, of course, pick different sports, but there's the theme of water. So I think that nicely sums up our takeaways from this year's Medicaid Drug Rebate Summit. Danny, where are we going for the after party?
Well, Chris, since we have one more night in Chicago, what do you say we go back to Sienna Tavern?
That sounds like an excellent choice. So Sienna Tavern, one of my favorites. have taken clients there many times for lunches and dinners, including before the pandemic, and was very happy to be able to go back. And as you know, we were just there last night having a nice dinner at Siena Tavern. It's Italian food, it's excellent food, but also it's a nice restaurant, and the staff super friendly. So if you're looking for a nice lunch or a nice dinner with excellent food and a great environment, Siena Tavern would be the place to go in Chicago. Thanks to Danny for joining me, and thank you to our listeners for checking out the Latham & Watkins Drug Pricing Series, which is part of our Connected with Latham podcast. You can subscribe and listen to new and archived episodes of Latham's podcast on lw.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. If you have questions or would like additional information, please email us using the links located in the show description. We hope you'll join us again next time.
This podcast is provided as a service of Latham & Watkins LLP. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and Latham & Watkins LLP, and you should not send confidential information to Latham & Watkins LLP. While we make every effort to assure that the content of this podcast is accurate, comprehensive, and current, we do not warrant or guarantee any of those things. And you may not rely on this podcast as a substitute for legal research and/or consulting a qualified attorney. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for engaging a lawyer to advise you on your individual needs. Should you require legal advice on the issues covered in this podcast, please consult a qualified attorney. Under New York's Code of Professional Responsibility, portions of this communication contain attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Results depend upon a variety of factors unique to each representation. Please direct all inquiries regarding the conduct of Latham & Watkins attorneys under the New York's disciplinary rules to Latham & Watkins LLP, 1271 Avenue of the Americas, New York, New York, 10020. Phone number 1-212-906-1200.